Several months ago, I moved to a new town that is about an hour away from the town I grew up in. I moved into a beautiful home that rested within a quiet suburban community. The opposite of the neighborhood I grew up in. The most peculiar and, quite frankly, the most amazing thing about my new home was the fact that I knew my neighbor. It was my old childhood friend, Rode. If I had made a list of people I was sure that I would never see again, RD would be top of that list. Growing up, we kids in the neighborhood always get together and played sports, play tag, rode bikes, and basically just acted like degenerate youths. Of all the kids in my neighborhood, RD was one of my best friends. When we were kids, video games were just starting to get popular, not like they are today. RD and I were the only two that loved video games and spent more time than anybody else sitting inside and playing them. We'd still play outside with everybody else, but we were more invested in our video games. I even remember specifically many times when Artie would stay overnight, and we play games all night long. Sadly, when I was in 5th grade, Artie and his family moved away. We called each other a few times, but we lost touch and never reconnected. When MySpace first came out, we became friends on that platform, but he was living his own life somewhere else. And it just seemed like we had nothing in common anymore. By the time Facebook came around, I had all but forgotten about Already, and never even thought to look him up. Already was no more than a distant memory. And that was until I moved into my new home. And I was beyond shocked to find out that my neighbor was actually him. At first, it was amazing to see my old friend. We connected right away, and I was in shock that he lived back on the side of the United States. When we were kids, they moved to the East Coasts. It was just very surprising that he now lives so close to where we grew up. I asked him what brought him back to this part of the country, and he simply just said that he liked the West Coast more. After I got moved in, I invited Artie over for a couple of beers to catch up. When he showed up that night, he came with two of his friends, a man named Scott and Scott's girlfriend. Her name was Jane. And I thought it was a little rude that Artie showed up with people without asking me first. I didn't care and would have been okay with it. It's just really the principle of the matter. The three of them started acting weird as soon as they were inside. Scott and Jane were fascinated with all my stuff in my living room. Their eyes were zooming around my house, and it looked like they weren't even on the same planet as me. It was like they were taking a mental inventory of everything in my home. Every few minutes, I would notice Scott and Jane whispering to each other. Call me crazy, if you will, but I had a bad feeling brewing my stomach. Eventually, I brought up video games to Artie. I asked if he still played any games. He looked disgusted, and then laughed himself. In an arrogant and condescending voice. He said, "No way, man. I stopped playing video games when I was like 12. That stuff's for kids." I laughed out of habit and tried to mirror his attitude. I leaned back in my chair and said, "Man, I must have missed the memo when I was 12. Not only do I still play, but actually work on games for a living." Everyone in the room shared a small laugh. It was a burst of awkward laughter, if I'm being honest. I will say though, after sharing that bit of news, the mood in the room changed quite a bit. They all seemed very interested in what I had to say, and specifically what I did. Scott was asking very specific questions like if the computer that I had in the room was the computer I use for work, and worked at a studio as my main source of income. But I spent a lot of my time working on my home computer. And I'm working on my own indie game on my machine in the spare time. I shared all those details and much more with Artie, Scott, and Jane. We continued to hang out for a little while longer, and then we call into the night. The next day I saw RD outside, and I waved to him while I was heading to my car to run some errands. He waved, but he looked frustrated about something. That night I stayed and worked on my game all night. A little after 2 a.m. I got an alert on my phone that someone was at my door. I had a motion camera that was on the side of my front door, as well as a Ring camera on the doorbell. I pulled up the video, and I couldn't believe my eyes. There were 3 people on my front steps. All three were wearing masks and had hoods on. These were the masks that you would wear to the doctors, not like Halloween masks, and it looked like they were deliberating about something. Two of them were standing in the background and one of them was directly in front of the door. The one in front of the door turned around completely. So his back was facing the camera now. It was concealing something in the back of his waistband. It grabbed the handle of it and then let it go. And from that little action, I was able to tell exactly what it was concealing. Finally, he turned back once again and grabbed the doorknob. He turned the doorknob a few times testing to see if it was locked, and thank God it was. It took a step back as if he were deciding his next move. And that's when one potential intruder noticed the Ring camera. The person in the backyard, wait. And they pointed to the camera and was woman's voice that yelled wait. The intruder in front bent over and stared directly into the camera. Even with a mask on, it was obvious. The intruder directly in front of my camera was RD, which led me to believe the other two were his friends Scott and Jane that I met earlier. His eyes got wide as if he knew that he was caught. Scott and Jane turned and ran in the opposite direction of RD's house. Already took a few steps back, then came back to the door and shook the handle aggressively, trying one last time to get inside. He said something under his breath that I couldn't understand. And then he also ran. I called the police, gave them the footage, and reported every detail to them. Already didn't come home for days, probably because he knew that he was going to get caught. After a couple of days, I finally saw him sneaking into his own house. I called the police, who showed up quickly. It turns out after I reported it to the police, they were able to connect the dots to an entire string of home invasions. The nail in the coffin for Already and his accomplices was the fact that another house they robbed weeks ago also had a Ring camera. And they weren't wearing masks for that little outing. It was sad to see an old friend fall so far. Someone I had so many fond memories of turned and went down a completely dark path. Thankfully, their motion camera and Ring cameras saved my life. Never assume that you're immune from robbery or worse, based on where you live. I live in a very safe neighborhood with almost zero crime. The hardest part of moving to a town for people like me is making friends. Making friends in general is something I struggle with. Unfortunately, I am a bit on the awkward side, and I'm not afraid to admit that. Well, my job forced me to move hundreds of miles from my hometown. I was sad, but I couldn't pass up the chance. The work I do is important and it pays very well. My logic was that I would move away, make some money, and then move back to my hometown in a couple of years when my contract was completed. The first month in my new town was tough. After work, I sort of just went home and played video games and watched everything I could, but it was only a matter of time until loneliness crept its ugly head around. I eventually discovered a comic book store that was only about 5 minutes away from my new house. One thing about me is that I love comics. I've been reading Marvel comics since I was old enough to read, and in fact, probably even longer than that. I used to be obsessed with the illustrations in comics before I could even read, and I remember grabbing my brother's comics and just staring at the covers before I could even understand what the words even said. Finding this bookstore wouldn't cure my loneliness, but the comfort of comics would be a nice distraction for me. I started going a couple of times a week and got hooked once again on all my favorite comics. One day while I was perusing the new comic book section, I grabbed the latest Fantastic Four comic, and right at that moment, I was approached by an interesting-looking man. He was tall and very skinny. He had his thick black glasses and shoulder-length blonde hair. He had a beard, but there wasn't a good one. It was all patchy and all over the place. I moved out of the way, thinking that he wanted to get into that section, but instead he wanted to talk to me. In this thick southern accent, he said, "I mean, you find the Fantastic Four?" I smiled and nodded. I'm not the greatest with random interactions like that. Dude, you're gonna love it. It really knows how to write. The F for name is Pete, by the way. Not Peter Parker though. Many laughed as I did too. If anybody doesn't know, Peter Parker's the real name of the man underneath the Spider-Man mask. I looked at Pete and extended my hand and said, "Then nice to meet up," and give my name. From that strange and very awkward interaction, Pete and I became friends. We hung out several times a week and just talked about comics, Star Wars, video games, and basically anything nerdy that I was interested in. It was like this guy was created in a lab specifically to be my friend. For months, this continued, and I was happy with my new friend. One day when we were leaving the comic book shop, Pete said, "You know, I was thinking it was a sign, you move in hair and stuff, walking into that shop that day. It's like you're me, but from the multiverse," which is another comic book reference that Pete pulled out of nowhere. I just laughed and went along with it. And I did that along with P. Not too much longer. After that comments, I noticed that Pete was wearing the same clothes as me. I would wear my Fantastic Four shirt once a week at least. And before I knew it, so did Pete. I would wear a Darth Vader shirt, and then the next day, Pete would have the same one. I'm not saying people can't have the same shirts. It just seemed awfully strange that out of nowhere, he had the same shirts as me. Right around this time, he cuts his hair and shaves his beard. And if you're keeping track at home, I have short hair, and I'm clean shaven. When we hung out the day he got his haircut, he said, "Now we definitely look like we could be the same person. Do you think? Do you think maybe we actually are maybe we really are from the multiverse or something?" It didn't seem like one of Pete's comic book references anymore. This seemed weird and just off for some reason. I just dismissed his comment and started talking about food or something. It made me uncomfortable, and I just kind of wanted to redirect the conversation. That night, I couldn't help but think about it. I may not be articulating it well, but everything about the latest comment was just off his mannerisms, the way he looked, the way he talked, everything was just different. I thought about texting him that night and telling him that I felt uncomfortable, but I decided that I'm being paranoid and I left it alone. The next day, I was getting ready to leave for work. And when I opened the door, I could have sworn that I saw Pete's car. But as I said, I was being paranoid and just ignored my feelings. Pete had texted me to make sure that we were still on for the comic book store after work. And I told him yeah, even though I didn't want to. I worked for a few hours. But I had myself all worked up for some reason. I asked my supervisor if I could leave early because I wasn't feeling well. And she let me go just several hours into my shift. When I got home, the first thing I noticed was that the front door inside the screen door was open. I could never leave that door open. I have thousands of dollars worth of collectibles, comic books, and Funko Pops. And I approached the door slowly, and I entered quietly. I could hear movement coming from my office, which is where all those valuables I just mentioned are located. I snuck to the side door and peered inside the room, and in the closet, rummaging through boxes, was Pete. I barged in the room and said, "Pete, what are you doing?" He jumped and started to stutter a little bit. I was just trying to see if you had a certain comic, man. I was going to surprise you." I looked around the room on the drawers, and my desk were open on my computer was open. My social security card was in the desk. To the right of Pete was a box, and inside the box was a handful of my rarest comics, some of them being worth well over $5,000, and some personal financial documents were in the box. "Listen, man," he paused and started to look around the room. What I had just noticed, though, is he wasn't talking with that accent anymore. Before I could process my next thought, Pete grabbed the lamp that was on my desk, ripped it from the wall, and threw it at me as hard as he could. It hit me on the head. And when I bent over in pain, he punched me in the face as hard as it could, and I dropped to the ground. I was dizzy, and everything was foggy as I tried to get to my feet. I heard his car start and peel away. When I regained my focus, I noticed that he took that box of comics and documents. I called the police right away and gave them Pete's information. And that's when I realized Pete wasn't a friend at all. And never got his last name, mainly because I just never really thought about it or cared. I don't have social media, so I never even bothered to ask for his. We texted, but I didn't realize his phone was just some cheap track found the cops, and for me that Pete most likely wasn't his name. Inside the box were a couple of credit cards that I owned, as well as I didn't bring them with me to work or anything like that. I used one to get gas, but that was the only time it was used before I was able to cancel it. The cops informed me that whoever Pete really was, he knew somehow that I had money. He got to know me, and used our friendship to basically steal everything I had. Thankfully, he didn't get much from me. But he did get those comics that are worth in the 1000s. And they do mean more to me sentimentally than the money. To this day, I have no idea who Pete was and where my comics ever went. I was able to get one of my comics back only a week after this incident happened though. He had sorted to some pawn shop and the guy wasn't very nice about the entire situation. What was most horrific about the situation was that he told the pawn shop employee that his name was my name. And the pawn shop employee had to double take because he thought it was me when I went into the shop to try and actually look for the comic. Some people out there are truly scary and have very insidious intentions. It's scary to think about the people you consider close in your life and what they may think about you. I apologize in advance for how I may sound writing this, as I have yet to try and put this into text. I'm looking for just general advice, I suppose. First, I must preface this by saying I currently live with my girlfriend, and I do love her. However, I fear that my girlfriend is not the same woman anymore. We've been together for nearly 10 years, we started dating in our senior year of high school and have been together ever since. We both went away to separate colleges and stayed together that entire time. After graduating, we moved in together and have been happy until recently. I know what most people will assume because I have brought my concerns to friends who all say the same thing or versions of the same things. Most say things like she's probably with somebody else just doing drugs, or my personal favorite, she just doesn't love you anymore, man. If it were any of those, at least I would have clarification, but I assure you it's not. She's different now, like she's hiding something, but not someone else. It's almost as if though she's hiding something much darker. And I'll start at the beginning to try to remember as much as possible. Recently, I got home from work earlier than usual. Coming home early is not something that's rare for me, as my job has somewhat irregular hours. When I got home, she was in the shower. She didn't hear me come inside, but I heard her as soon as I got close to the bathroom. She was grunting and sounded angry. She kept yelling a series of curse words and continued to sound angry and upset about something. I knocked on the door to ask if she was all right, and the cursing stopped right away. She took a moment to respond and then said everything was okay. Once she got out of the shower, which took a very long time, I may add she looked anxious and extremely tense. Asked one more time if she was okay and sounding annoyed. She said yes and told me not to ask again. I backed off, figuring she just needed space for something. She's not the type of person to jump down anyone's throat. She's never short with me or anyone else, and after knowing her for almost 20 years and dating for almost 10, I can say with certainty that this was not her at all. The next morning, I woke up for work and showered. When I got into the shower, I noticed that there was something on the ledge where we kept the soap bottles. It kind of looked like dried blood. I picked up the bottle and there was a red ring that formed on the bottle. I started to look a little closer and I noticed dried residue and several of the nooks and crannies around the shower area. I was curious, but not tense or worried or anything like that. That afternoon when I got home, one of her newer friends was over at the house. Kind of a strange woman named Shauna. I'll be honest, I don't like Shauna. I don't know exactly where they met. Maybe she was a co-worker. Maybe she was one of my girlfriend's customers. I don't know. All I know is that she just rubbed me the wrong way. She would talk constantly about getting into trouble when she was younger, and all the wild stuff she did when she was in her 20s. Shauna was most likely in her mid to late 30s if I had to guess. So that afternoon when I walked inside, my girlfriend and Shauna were acting weird. I noticed the laptop on the kitchen table, and when I got inside, they shut the laptop and seemed like they were trying to get me to leave the kitchen. I know something was wrong. I could see it on my girlfriend's face, but I didn't dare ask again. And went into the bedroom and shut the doors so I could change from my work clothes. I could hear Shauna whispering something to my girlfriend, and she sounded 10, and next thing I know I heard a door slam. And when I went back out there, Shannon was pulling out of my driveway. My girlfriend is normally outgoing and bubbly as can be. But now she seemed more like a zombie or someone who hasn't slept in days. It became clear to me that she was hiding something. I truly didn't think that she was with someone else. It's not her character. Ordinarily, I wouldn't snoop. We don't have that kind of relationship. But when I opened the laptop, her last page was still open. She was looking at weapons to purchase, and the website was not something I recognized. It looks shady. This could be something to note about her. She's very anti-gun and anti-weapon in general. So to be on a page like this is extremely out of character. And this was a prompted me to look at the last few pages in the search history. And it was strange to say the least. There were several news articles about people who were missing, and 2 web pages with directions to what appeared to be in the middle of nowhere. As the days passed, I noticed that she became more and more of a husk of her former self. No laughing, no smiles, no intimacy, no semblance of my girlfriend. I started to notice weird things like her shoes were extremely muddy. Her phone was almost always turned off, and her computer mysteriously broke the day after I searched the history. I saw Shauna one more time a few days ago when I got home from work. Her car was outside running, and it looked full of luggage. I walked inside and Shauna looked angry. She looked at me, then back at my girlfriend. She sighed, walked out of the house, and peeled off in her car. When she left, my girlfriend was white as a ghost and sat on the couch. And I asked one last time she was okay. She said, "I will be soon." Shauna, just a love doesn't matter. I will be soon. I promise. I tried to unpack that statement a million times, and I still am not 100% sure what she meant. It is now a few days removed from when Shauna left, and my girlfriend is still not herself. My girlfriend is taking personal time off. So she hasn't left the house in days. My first thought was that maybe Shauna and her had something romantic together. But when I asked her about it, she denied it fiercely. After a couple of battles, she told me to leave it alone and stop asking. And the eyes that looked at me, I just barely recognize them anymore. I don't know what's happening. My girlfriend, my best friend, is lost somewhere in her mind, and not the same woman I have loved for so long. If anybody reading this, please just give me some of your thoughts. I've done everything I can think of, and I'm worried that she may have done something horrible. If this story progresses anymore, I have any more news, I'll try to update you over email. Let's read, and as of right now, I'm grasping at straws, and praying that my girlfriend bounces back soon and that my worst thoughts are nothing more than dark fantasies plaguing my mind. When I was 20 years old, I was arrested for the first time, and unfortunately, it would not be the last. During my entire 20s, I was in and out of jail. On my 30th birthday, I decided to make a change in my life. I realized that I had no friends, no direction. I tried different churches and clubs in my community to see if I could find my calling in life. During my search for meaning, I found Barry. It was exactly what I needed in life, especially at this point. I had met Barry at some church event. And Barry said that he identified as agnostic, which I found strange being that it was a church event. But he said that he came to all the church events because of the community aspect. He claimed that all the people were outrageously friendly, and there was no other places in the world to get this loving camaraderie. It was right about that. The people were so friendly at this place. I'm not good at religion, so I'm not even sure what kind of church this was. All I know is that the people were fantastic. Everybody loved Barry, even the church officials. Nobody cared about his stance on faith. They just loved them. Anyways, Barry was great to these people. He was constantly helping in any way he could. And he would donate clothes, food, and most importantly, his time. I'm not sure how Barry made his money, but he had a lot of it and used it for good. He would constantly give to the poor and encourage everyone to come to the events of the church. He would serve food to the less fortunate on the front lines. He would drive to very low-income areas of the city and help in any way that he could. Very well, as by all accounts an amazing human being. In my search for meaning, obviously I gravitated right to Barry. With no judgment in his character, Barry took me under his wing and kind of became his partner. I helped with everything that Barry did in the community. It seemed like being with him almost cleared my name. Nobody cared who I was in the past, they only cared about me in the present. This life continued for a couple of years for me. Barry became more than a partner and in fact, became an actual friend. When I had nowhere to live, Barry let me move into a small guest house. We wake up early, start our day and just make our rounds in the city doing whenever we could, and Barry funded everything. This guy seemed to have an endless supply of money, and I never questioned it. One afternoon when we were doing some charity event, I noticed for the first time that Barry wasn't himself. This guy was always energetic and excited about life. But they seemed quiet, almost like he was on another planet. That night, we were heading back to his house, and I asked if he was all right. And all he did was take a deep breath, sigh, and just said he was fine. Clearly something was wrong that night, and looked at the windows of the guest house that said, just behind Barry's house, his lights were on, and the blinds were open. So I could clearly see inside of his house. The guest house said probably 50 feet or so from the house. So even though I could clearly see in the house, I was still far enough away that I couldn't tell if he was okay. Maybe I just had a bad feeling. But I think my life of crime just gave me insight into when people were just going to break. I hit my breaking point a lot in life is what got me in trouble most of the time. And it just seemed like Barry was at that point today. I thought about it for a while. But I eventually decided to go check on him just to make sure that he was okay. The guy gave me so much, and I figured I at least owed him this. I made my way through the yard that separated the guest house and his house. When he got close to the house, I could hear yelling. It was Barry, he was screaming. I started to sneak toward the house now to eavesdrop. I admit that I got close enough to be able to hear him clearly. He must have been on the phone because I could only hear him and not anybody else. He sounded so rageful and angry. And I never heard him raise his voice before. And now he was screaming, swearing, saying things I still can't believe came out of his mouth. I sneaked to the side of the house so I could peer into one of the windows. I saw Barry frantically pacing around the house, and he was indeed on the phone. I heard him clearly say, "I don't care. If you don't get this done, I'll find someone else who can. I don't deal with this crap day in and day out for no reason. Get this done immediately so I can finally get out of this hell." That's exactly what he said. Obviously, I have no idea what he meant by all of that in the moment. He hung up the phone and threw it at the wall as he continued to scream. But no notice, he turned and saw me looking through the window. I dove out of the way when I was sure he saw me. I laid on the side of his house and hoped that I didn't hear the door open. The hope only less than the moment, because the front door whipped open and I heard Barry screaming my name. Arose my feet, embarrassed that I got caught snooping. Part of me figured that he would be okay because he was always so calm and patient with me. But I couldn't have been more wrong. The large middle-aged man grabbed the collar of my flannel and pushed me against the house. He started screaming so loud in my face. I could feel the spit hitting my cheek at everything I did for you. I find you out here spying on my personal business. I was quiet. I didn't know what to say to them. I wanted to tell them that it was solely over there to make sure he was all right. But I couldn't get the words out. He threw me to the ground and again shouted at me, saying, "It was you, wasn't it? You're the one trying to get my money." I started to defend myself, claiming that I had no idea what he was talking about, which was true. When I started to get to my feet, he pushed me down again and kicked me in the face and yelled, "Stay here." And then he stormed back inside, slamming the door on his way, and the kick rocked me. I was dazed and saw stars in front of my eyes for a moment. I regained my focus and got to my feet again. I looked in the window and he was rummaging through a chest that he had in the room. He seemed to be grabbing something, but I wasn't sure what it was. But it sounded heavy. I ran back to the guest house, not wanting to take any chances. I grabbed a couple of personal items and ran into the woods that lined his property. I hid in the tree line and saw Barry wandering around the guest house and then eventually breaking down the door. He continued screaming my name and shouting for me to stop hiding. And he was indeed carrying something, but like before, I couldn't exactly tell what it was. It was long, narrow when he was using it to knock back the doors. Finally, he reached the tree line. I was quietly making my way down the wooded area. Thankfully, he was shouting so he couldn't hear me shuffling through the trees. I eventually made it to the road and ran as fast as I could, as far as I could. I'd look back every few minutes, but never saw him following me. When I got to a local convenience store, I asked if the store could please call the police for me, as I didn't have a cell phone at the time. When they showed up, I told them everything. I didn't really know if there was anything they could do, but I figured since Barry technically attacked me and then chased me, I did feel as if though I was in danger. The police showed up at his house, and the next thing I know, he was arrested. I don't know what he was arrested for, as it was never informed for some reason. But when I googled his name, nothing comes up, which leads me to believe that Barry was actually a fake name. I spent years with this guy and even lived just a few yards from his house. And he never once led me to believe that he was hiding anything or even had a violent bone in his body. Whatever secret he had finally collapsed on him. I have no idea if he intended on harming me more that evening. But the beating I received outside his house convinced me otherwise. Does anybody out there have any idea what Barry could have been doing or what he could have been hiding? I just want answers. Sometimes it's the best people that are hiding the darkest secrets.